Welcome, everyone. We are holding here a little bit while people are joining our webinar. We will start in a few seconds. Good afternoon, everyone. We are waiting a few more seconds for people that are joining us on the webinar today, and we'll get going here shortly. Okay, so let's get going with our webinar this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Spring Gardening Seminar webinar series presented by Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State Universities, and our sponsors. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful April afternoon here. My name is Natalie Smith and I will be your host today. I have in the background working with me as a co-host, Master Gardener Marilyn Clark. Our presenters today are Pat Colling and Chris Meow, and they will be talking about how to be Waterwise in the garden. But first, I would like to do some housekeeping for our webinar. All of the videos and microphone for our attendees are off, except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A window. If you look at the bottom bar of your Zoom webinar, you will see a Q&A window. Bring it up and type the questions there. We will reserve time at the end of the presentation to answer anything that is not directly addressed during the slide presentation. The presentation is being recorded and it will be available online for a short period of time following the session for about 30 days. A few days after the session, you will be sent an email with a link to the recording so you can access it. That email will also contain links to any and all of the resources that will be mentioned in the presentation today. So when we mention a resource and a link to it, that will be forwarded to you in that email as well. So now I would like to introduce our presenters today. Chris Meow and Pat Colling have a combined 32 years as active master gardeners. They have broad experience in all types of gardening in Central Oregon. They assisted in the design and helped create the Holland's Head Waterwise Garden in 2017 in conjunction with the Bend Park and Rec District, the City of Bend, OSU Extension Service, and the Central Oregon Master Gardener Association. They continue to manage the garden today with a team of Master Gardener volunteers. Our topic today is Be Waterwise in the Garden. With continuing drought and increased population growth in Central Oregon, water conservation in the garden is becoming critical. Your garden does not have to be dry, lack color and variety to be water efficient, however. Pat and Chris will share with you the wisdom they've gained in the development and maintenance of the Holland's Head Waterwise Garden. And you also will learn tips on planning, plant selection, irrigation, and maintenance of a beautiful Waterwise garden. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Pat and Chris.
Thanks, Natalie. Chris and I are excited to get to present to you some hopefully helpful tips about being water-wise in the garden. Before we get started though, two things. First of all, we're going to do a short poll. Again, Marilyn, would you please start the poll? And participants, will you please just quickly answer? There's only 2 short questions. People see the poll questions? Can we share the results of the poll? There we go. Good. It's always helpful to see how long people have been here in Central Oregon. So it's, you know, I can see that there's 20% of folks almost who have been here less than a year, but then lots of you have also been here for a longer period of time. And then whether you're currently conserving, and I like the I'm trying, I get that 56%, that makes a lot of sense. I think we're all trying. So hopefully you'll get some good information here today that will help you to do that. So one other thing for those of you who did poll prior to, that was sent out to you prior to the webinar getting started when you registered, it was pretty interesting results. And I'll just quickly, around 58% of you have a current garden that you're currently considering doing some retrofitting in. About 28–30% are looking at a new garden. And so we're going to address both of those issues, both how do you make changes in your current garden and how do you move into developing a whole new garden. And lots of questions around irrigation. Hopefully we'll cover all of those things. So I want to thank you for completing that poll as well. So we're going to get started. I think most of you already have seen some of this information. This is information that's been out in our local papers about the drought. You know, we know that a drought was declared actually in the middle of March, and something that we are all very concerned about. The reservoirs are currently really dry throughout the Tri-County area, not just in Deschutes County. And we do know that the fact that we haven't had a lot of winter precipitation, we also haven't had a lot of spring rain. So something else to consider when you think about the drought and where we're going this growing season. Oregon is very dry. The Pacific Northwest is very dry. And, you know, this is not to scare you. This is just to really put in perspective some of the things that we're going to talk about and some of the things that we can do about it. So with that, oops, one more picture. Sorry, forgot this one. This is from the U.S. Drought Monitor. The U.S. Drought Monitor monitors drought across the entire United States. And you can see here, this is Crook County, which is in exceptional drought. So really severe, exceptional drought. Jefferson County, more than half is in exceptional drought, and even, you know, about a third of Deschutes County is in what is called this exceptional drought. So, you know, this is something we're just going to have to try to live with, and hopefully our plants will tolerate it. So with that, we all know that then water efficient gardening is a great idea. And it sounds just like from your poll that you're concerned about it too. So that's really positive that people are taking that sort of proactive approach and want to do something to conserve water. We want a nice landscape. You know, we really know that that's something that we should do, but people use a lot of water for outdoor landscape. So we want to see what we can do to decrease that use of water. There are 7 principles of Waterwise gardening. These 7 principles, as you can see, are planting and design, irrigation, soil prep, plant selection, turf grass, mulch, and landscape maintenance. We're going to talk about each one of these principles in time and talk about how water conservation and how dealing with the drought will be interwoven in each one of these different principles. And with that, Chris, it's up to you.
Okay, starting off talking about the first step of planning and design of your Waterwise garden. Basically, the planning process is the same as with any kind of a conventional garden, except there is one major difference, which we'll get into as we move through the presentation. This plan is going to give you the roadmap and keep you on track throughout the planning process or the development process. And it is a critical step. So I encourage you not to skip over it and jump right into getting the work done, whether you do it yourself, the plan, or hire somebody to do it, it'll be well worth the effort to do this plan. The first thing that you usually do with the plan is to assess your site. What do you have to work with in your garden? What's the topography like? Do you have slope? Do you have down areas? Do you have hot spots, cold spots? What is your site like with structures or big trees that you have to work with to incorporate into your plan? And of course, you need to assess what you want your landscape to be. How are you going to use it? Do you need play areas? Do you need a barbecue area? Are you going to have a vegetable garden? How do you want it to look? What kind of style are you going to be having in your garden? And another thing that many people forget to take into consideration is how much time do you really want to devote to the maintenance of the garden? Are you a gardener at heart and love to be out there, or are you busy with other things and you really don't have time to spend a lot of time in the garden? A fun part of the planning process is the, you went too fast, Pat.
I did, sorry.
Back.
I
There
did.
we go.
I already went back.
Is to collect different ideas that will exemplify those things that you want to do in your garden. If you're going to change your hardscape in your garden, look for different options with permeable pavers and those kinds of things. If you've got problem areas in your garden, what have others people done and how did they solve those kinds of things with things like runoff and that kind of thing. For those of you who are working on your existing garden, you're going to take an additional step, and that is assessing your current garden. We're now going to move into that point of the plan that's different in a water conserving garden than from a conventional garden, and that's hydrozones. And a hydrozone is an area in your garden where you're grouping together plants that have similar water requirement needs. And this is going to be actually the main driver of much of your plan and your garden. It's going to drive your design. It's going to control your irrigation system. It's going to be the basis for the selection of all of the plants you're doing and where you're going to place them in the garden. So you can see that this is a key component of any water efficient garden. Now, the hydrozones are in 4 different levels, going from very low to high. You don't have to include all of these in a garden that you're developing, but obviously the more space you devote to very low and low requirement plants, water requirement plants, the more water you're going to conserve. The low water requirement hydrozones is where you're going to get the greatest savings. And those usually don't need any additional water after the plants have been established, and you may very well not need any irrigation system at all in the very low zones. For those where you're using plants that have low water requirements, you will need an irrigation or supplemental irrigation there, and they'll probably be the largest areas in your garden where you'll have the most plants. The moderate zone is an area where you'll use about 50% less water than in a conventional garden. In the high water use areas, hopefully this will be a small size of your garden and it will have a specific use. You'll know why you want that. Is it going to be your play area? Is that what your lawn is going to be like? Do you have some really prized high special plants that you really want to include in your garden, but they do take a lot of water? Well, you can devote a small portion of your garden to that. So these zones, there we go, this chart, this is a different way to show the hydrozones. You can see in that middle column the approximate amount of water that's required per week in those. And if any of you know how much water you're putting on your garden now, I'd be willing to bet that it's more than what you're using in each of these zones. The high irrigations or hydrozone are plants like, that's your grass, turf grass, certain trees like willows and birches, and here they're the western juniper. All of those really suck up a lot of water. The moderate zone are things like deciduous trees, which we usually have a number of those in our garden. The low hydrozone is mostly perennials and shrubs, and you'll be surprised a little bit later when we go into discussing the plants that you can have in each of these zones, how many of the current plants that you're probably using may already have in your garden do fit in this low hydrozone. In the very low zone, people often think that it's exclusively native plants. You can use a lot of natives from the high desert or other Mediterranean climates around the world, but there's also many conventional kinds of plants that you can include in this very low zone. So let's get into retrofitting your existing gardens just a little bit here. As part of your design, actually doing the retrofit is going to take a lot more energy and time and devotion than doing the new garden, primarily because you're going to have to assess your your existing garden in all kinds of capacities before you can move into completing your plan and installing your new garden. That includes all of your plants, any kind of existing hardscape that you have, and especially your irrigation system are all going to have to be assessed and determine what you're going to do with those in your new garden. And you're probably going to have to make some tough decisions when you're going through this process, because there will be some changes in your garden. You're going to have to reduce it in various places or those kinds of things. The main thing that you're going to do here is plant in your hydrozones. So you're going to have to decide which of your existing plants you're going to keep to put in your hydrozones and where you're going to put them. You're going to have to look at all different elements that are in your garden and decide how you're going to deal with those. For example, if you have runoff, do you want to create a dry riverbed to help deal with that kind of a problem? So there's all those different elements in your landscape that you're potentially going to have to change. And then your irrigation system, you're going to be changing with the primary focus of reducing water use. And that can be as simple in many cases as changing your sprinkler heads, but in a lot of other cases too, it's a completely redo of your irrigation system. And finally, you are going to have to decide how you're going to execute this, whether you're doing the new garden or changing your existing garden. Two basic ways, of course, is whether you're going to do it all at once or whether you're going to do it gradually. In each case, in whichever approach you choose, you're going to want to have your plan final and everything complete so you'll know exactly what you have to, what you're looking at doing. Then whether you decide to do it all at once, largely depends on whether you have the time and the resources and the labor to be able to tackle that all at once. If you're going to do a gradual or a phased in process, you have to decide what you're going to do first. And actually, if you do the new garden, I would actually look at your soil first so that you can make all the amendments you need to do and changes to your soil without other obstructions before you do anything else, and then go to your irrigation and then to your planting. With an existing garden, you probably want to be looking at changing your irrigation system first, because you can't make any kind of changes to your plantings until you have your water system set up. And in those circumstances, you'll probably be doing your soil as you go through it, one by one, section by section. So now that you started, you're going to work on your irrigation plan, and Pat's going to talk about that.
Okay. In its simplest form, of course, the goal of irrigation is to get water to the plants. And you want to get as much water to the plants as they need without any extra. So, you want to make sure that when you put that water down, that there's not a lot of runoff. And really the goal is to make sure that you're watering to encourage deep root growth. And that's really going to help your plants to be better tolerant of drought. So instead of just a little water, a little bit at a time, you're going to try to do more water in a longer period of time without any runoff, so that there's really good deep watering to the plant. Chris already talked about the hydrozones. You're going to keep hearing that word, but I don't need to go into that right now. Hydrozones is the way you plan your irrigation system. And then, thinking about an automatic irrigation system, they're very time efficient, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about automatic irrigation and some of the things that you can do to save water with that. So, as I said, when you're planning your irrigation, you want to design a system that really effectively delivers water to the plants. And, using the hydrozones, that's going to allow you to tailor the amount of water that goes down on a plant to the plant's needs. So that's really what you're doing. You're saying that, okay, this is a very low water use plant. I don't need to water this very much. So this zone needs to look different than it does if I have a high water use plant, like my turf. The irrigation systems for both of those two types of plants are going to look remarkably different. And they should, because you're really going to want to target the irrigation zone that you design to the type of plant that you're going to plant there. And I think one of the hardest parts is if you have a current garden and you're retrofitting it, it's really difficult to know where to start. One of the things that if you live in the city of Bend that you can tap into is the city of Bend does have a sprinkler inspection program. They'll come to your home and assess your system, tell you where problems are, and give you some recommendations about what you might change. You should also look at what you can adapt. And Chris kind of touched on this. Can you change sprinkler heads? Should you convert to drip? How much drip? What kinds of drip? What can I add? Do I have zones that there's no planting? Can I just completely turn those zones off? And then, of course, identifying any kind of waste that you might have in your irrigation system. And I think we all see waste in irrigation systems when we see water running down the road. So there are a couple of different types of irrigation systems. One is the drip. A drip system is very efficient. It delivers a small amount of water over a very graduated length of time. There's two types of drip: inline drip, which really you use when you have more densely planted areas. And that's because the emitters on the drip line are spaced out either 8 to 12 inches. And so you want to put those drip lines where there's a lot of plants. The other type of drip is a point source drip. This you would use where you have a sparser planting where you can encircle a particular plant with a drip line with point source drip. They're both drip systems though. And then the other one, which is a higher amount of waters put down, is the overhead systems. And they are either a spray, a rotor, or a high efficiency type of emitter. One of the things you really can do is looking at changing out your sprinkler heads to a more high efficiency, lays out water over a longer period of time to stop runoff. Irrigation controllers, oops, sorry, oops. There are lots of different kinds of irrigation controllers. You can go to some local irrigation businesses in town and they would be happy to go over with you the different types of smart controllers. They really are adjusted based on the actual weather conditions in the area. They have sensors that tell whether you need to water because it's hot or whether it's rained. But the one important thing to remember about irrigation controllers is don't set them and forget them. Don't do that. You really should be modifying your irrigation controller regularly throughout the season if you don't have a smart controller according to weather conditions. So how do I know how much I should be watering? You know, how do I know whether I'm actually watering deep enough into my garden? Well, you have to get down and dig down into it. I mean, that's the really only way to do it is to get down into the dirt and assess it. You can use either a soil probe, which is this long guy here, or you can use a trowel, but you should dig down 6 to 8 inches and actually see how the soil is doing, whether the water is penetrating. This is moist soil, right? You shouldn't need to water. If you dig down and you get a soil ball like this that's kind of crumbly, then that plant probably needs additional water. That area needs additional water. You also want to water evenly. This is an example of using a drip system. So this is a drip kind of system, but placing it on only one side of a plant. And you can see what happens here is the roots are nice and strong on the one side of the plant, but pretty sparse on the other. So there's not great root development on the right side of this plant. But by placing the drip system on each side of the plant, you're going to see much better soil absorption, more even distribution of water, and the plant is going to have a much more healthy root system. Watering guidelines are really specific. A lot of them very specific to the city that you live in, but there are lots and lots of local water use rules if you're on city water. For example, Bend, the city of Bend, you water on odd or even days, depending on your address. You don't water during the heat of the day. You know, those kinds of things are just kind of common sense things that I think probably most cities have. You want to apply, like I said, the irrigation at a low rate so that you don't have a lot of waste. And we talked about infrequent deep watering really does help to encourage root growth. So the watering every other day may not be what your plants need. You know, just because it says you can water on odd or even days, it may not be what the plants need. So you want to assess what that situation is. And then Redmond and Prineville, they both have different types of water conservation pieces. Redmond does a irrigation system rebate, and Prineville has a system as well. And their websites are on the resources, so you can go directly to their resources if you live in those cities. Here's some of the more egregious don'ts. Don't water concrete. Don't water when you keep watering when you have a pool of water there. That water is just running off. It's not being absorbed into the soil. And don't water in the heat of the day. Don't make sure that all the water that you're watering is not being evaporating into the air. So you want to make sure that you don't do these don'ts. In a drought, some of the things that you can do is over the course of a few weeks, for plants that are established, you can start decreasing the amount of water that you're putting on those plants, allowing the plant to sort of adjust to the decreased water. So that's one thing that you might think about doing when if we're really looking at water restrictions, or you live in an area where you really need to restrict it. Think about decreasing the amount of water. The smart controller is a good thing to do, just checks the water for you. Make sure that you repair any leaks that you might have. That's really important to do. You can lose a lot of water that way. Checking to the sprinkler heads, avoiding watering your sidewalks, etc. Those are common sense things, but lots of people I see have those kinds of issues. And then looking at the hydrozones and the drip system. Soil preparation is the next area, and this really comes right down to amending the soil. Our soil is very sandy, doesn't have a lot of organic material, and water just goes quickly through it and goes straight down. So your goal is to try to get a loamy type of soil. And the reason you do that is the plants absorb water better, and the water spreads out. So adding organic matter, well composted materials quickly help to improve the soil. You can use lawn clippings, chopped leaves, all of these things help to amend the soil and really prepare your plants, allow them to absorb the water, and something that you really want to do. That's just one of the basics of any gardening, really. Okay, we're going to move on to plant selection. Chris, up to you.
Okay. The plant selection is key in a Waterwise garden. You do have to pay attention to the water requirements of the plant. Gone are the days when we used to go to the nursery and see a plant we like and buy several and just pop them into your garden, and you went on your merrily way. Well, now you really do have to know your plant before you buy it or keep it in your garden. When I'm looking at plants, the basic things that I look at first off is I check the hardiness zone to make sure that it's going to have a good chance of being able to survive here in the Central Oregon climate. For those of you who are new, we are in the zone, the hardiness zones of 3 to 6, depending upon your location in Central Oregon. But the second factor to look at is its water requirement use. And usually you can find that on the tag. Sometimes it's not there. So you'll have to do some research before you decide whether it's a plant you're going to keep or whether you're going to purchase it. And those plants are the ones that are going to be placed in the appropriate water zones, the hydrozones. So according to your design, you can see where your hydrozone is going to be, and you'll know what kind of plants you want to place in that area, how big that area is, how you're going to design and place your plants in that area. So that's going to be a key step in knowing all of that prior to selecting the plants that you're going to use. Now, a lot of people have thought that any kind of Waterwise gardening or xeriscaping is, they have to be all native plants, and that's not really true at all. It can be a combination of any kind of plant, that as long as it meets the water requirements. And one thing to be careful of if you are doing the native garden is that not all native plants are drought tolerant. So you do have to do your research on those just as you would for any of the other plants. And on the other side of that equation, not all conventional plants are high water use or moderate water uses. You can find a lot in the low and the very low categories. Many plants have adapted themselves to functioning well in arid climates. So those plants are often ideal to include in your garden selection. Many of them have adapted roots, more extensive systems, deep tap roots, or shallow, widespread root systems that go out and gather water from other places or can take advantage of light showers. Then other plants have adapted their leaves so that they can tolerate dry times a lot better than the hairy leaves. They block the wind and provide a little bit of shade. Curled leaves, they reduce the exposure to sun and wind. Of course, waxy leaves prevent the loss of water. Succulent leaves, they store water up for the plant for future use. Blue or silver tinted leaves reflect the sun a lot better. So if you see these characteristics in plants in the nursery, then you have a pretty good idea that they may fit very well in your Waterwise garden. Let's look at the plants that fit in a number of the very low use water categories, and then we'll go on to the low. You don't have to hurry and try to collect or write down each of these plants in the various categories, because remember, you're going to get access to the the recording, and you also will be able to find these. Can you see them there? Then in the Waterwise in Central Oregon gardening book. This is an OSU publication, and you can access it through the link that's in the resource section. But you can see a number of the perennials commonly in your garden, like the black-eyed Susan, the blue flax, penstemons, red hot pokers, are very low water use plants. Ground covers in this category include things like ice plant and the stone crops and the woolly thyme. So there's quite a bit to choose from there in this low water category. Other plants in the very low water use category, the ornamental grasses include like this Indian rice grass, which is really a beautiful grass. Small shrubs, some of the natives, the fern bush or desert sweet, the rabbit brush, which is usually out in the native areas, but can be very effective in a landscape garden. Medium shrubs like the bitter brush, which we have around for deer food to attract them from our own other plants, but and there aren't too many large shrubs that fit in the very low water use category. Now let's look quickly at the low water use plants. Perennials include the agastache, which are absolutely stunning plants. Lots of catmint, the salvias, yarrows, lavender, and even daylilies are low water use plants. Ground covers like the candy tuft and the dianthus and the speedwell are plants that are wonderful in a low water use hydrozone. The ornamental grasses that fit in this category, you have a greater selection here, things like blue fescue and switchgrass and the fountain grasses. Small shrubs commonly seen around are potentilla, the Russian sage, the blue mist spirea, both of those blooming in the later summer, which are wonderful. The medium shrubs like barberries, and for the rose lovers, it does fit in the low water category. Larger shrubs, you probably already have some of these too. The forsythias and the lilac and the mock orange and the nine bark are all very acceptable for the low water hydrozone. So you do have lots to choose from in establishing your hydrozones in your garden. So now you've selected your plants that you're going to put in your garden, the ones you're going to keep and the ones that you're potentially going to purchase. But there's the hard question in the drought time is as to whether we should be planting at all in a drought, and especially a severe drought like we're going into. Just keep in mind that all plants, whether they're brand new plants or ones that you're moving from your a transplant in your garden, the root system is often left behind during this transplanting process, and it's going to need a lot more water to help get those roots reestablished for those plants. So you're going to need to put more water on for the new plantings that you have in your garden. So you might consider planting fewer plants than you might normally. Install your garden in phases over a period of several years so that you don't overstretch the lower amount of water that we have available to us. A similar kind of question is whether you should plant in the spring or the fall. Well, both of those time periods are when plants have vigorous root growth. So that's a good thing if you're reestablishing a plant. But during the spring, of course, you know that you're going into the driest and the hottest time of the year, and they're going to need more water to get established and even more to accommodate the summer conditions. So in a drought, spring planting may not be ideal to do. Fall planting is better. Hopefully the weather has cooled and the evaporation off the plants and leaves is reduced, and your soil is going to hold a little bit more moisture. We keep our fingers crossed that we will begin to have some rain in the fall. So the fall may be a little bit better time to plant, but you always have to be conscious there of those unplanned freezes that come along in the fall. So be prepared to protect your plants if you need to. And as always, you have to transplant, you have to get that root system established. You're going to get that water evenly distributed, as Pat talked about. One technique that you can use to help do that, particularly if you're hand watering, is to put the moat around a plant that will hold the water right in there. And then finally, it's essential that you be sure you put the mulch onto those plants, and we'll be talking about mulching just a little bit later. A final section here about drought with your plants is that if you have to sacrifice things in your garden, how do you decide to do that? Well, one of the ways you can do that is to decide on the basis of what's valuable. And what's valuable to you may be quite different than what's valuable to your neighbor. But once you decide the things that are most valuable to you about your garden and the plants, then you can work from there. Some of the things that you might consider for criteria are the cost involved with the plant, looking at saving the most expensive, the criteria of whether it can be easily replaced on a timely basis, or the criteria may be what you love the most and you really can't bear to lose that plant in your garden. So if you look down through trees, you can see your mature trees. They have been in your garden a long time. They do have a good root system, so they may not take as much water. But if you were to lose that tree, you may have then a huge gap in your landscape system. It would be probably very expensive to take that tree out, and it may be a very long time before you can ever replace that, and it might potentially cost a lot of money. young and newly transplanted trees are similar in that they are going to require a lot more water to keep those root systems developing when they're new, but you transplanted or put in those new trees for a particular reason. And if that's continuing to work for you, then you may want to bump that tree up on your save list. When you're talking about shrubs, of course, they're less expensive than the trees and they can reestablish in a shorter period of time. So that may be something that you want to consider sacrificing. You can also evaluate that shrub and see whether it's working well in your garden. Is it old and overgrown, or is it encroaching on some other plants or a walkway or something? And this may be a good time to remove that shrub so it's not using up water from other plants. The perennials, of course, are less expensive in your garden and they're going to be easier to replace. So you may have to sacrifice some of those. And of course, annuals, they require a lot of water, and we recommend that you use them very sparingly or not at all in a garden during drought. As well as containers. We all know that containers dry out sooner. They have to be watered multiple times a day, oftentimes though, so potentially consider foregoing using any of your containers. And if you do, put them in the shade if you can, and plant them with low water use plants if you can. And Pat, I'm turning it over to you to talk.
Okay, well, I will rush right through these things. We're going to talk a little bit about practical turf grass, which is basically your lawn. When you're planting a lawn, you want to question how much do you really need? Is it something that you need for a play area? Are you thinking about it in terms of keeping down the dust? Is it a defensible space? If you're in a fire-prone area, a lawn is a good defensible space. So it's something that you should consider. You can keep it, however, as minimal as possible. One of the things to think about when you're irrigating a lawn and planting it, it's a lot tougher to irrigate a narrow strip or a curved area. So think about that when you're actually planting your lawn, if you're planting a new garden, and make sure that it's part of your irrigation plan, because you're going to want to separate how you irrigate your lawn from the rest of your landscape, because it is going to take more water. It's a high water use plant. There are other options in terms of lawn that people are starting to use more and more. You can use clump fescues. And I've got a photo to show you what a clump fescue lawn can look like. You can use things like woolly thyme. Of course, you can replace it with different kinds of walkways like riverbeds or pathways. There are different types of lawn seed mixes out there. One is an eco lawn that you might be able to find in some of our retail stores. There are also drought tolerant mixes that some of the more specialized landscape stores have as well. But you really should, and we all have cool season grasses here. It's the only thing that really survives. We don't have warm season grasses. It's too cold in the winter. So that's a turf type tall fescue, and it does go dormant under dry conditions. And we all know that if the summer goes on, our lawns dry out, but they do revive, but they do need minimum water to revive. This is a picture of a lawn that's made with fescue bunch grass. This person, I walk by his home all the time, and he planted it about 10 years ago, and it was more clearly bunches at that time, but he only waters it twice a week, and it's mowed only 3 times per season. So it's a very low maintenance, relatively low water use turf that can be walked on, and that gives you the appearance of a lawn. Now, of course, this is the same time of season as the rest of us, so it is kind of yellow right now, but it does green up. So just something else to keep in mind. That's a fescue bunch grass. Oops. Sorry, went too far. So what do you do about your existing lawn? You know, many of us have an existing lawn and, you know, there's not a lot we can do to change that. So if you do have a lawn, you should know how much water you're putting down on it. Measure the amount. You can get these little cups that measure the amount of water that you're putting down. You place it around your lawn, you water normally, and you see how much water you're actually putting on your lawn. Of course, you also do the dig down to see how deep you're getting and actually measure it, because you may be surprised that you're putting more water on your lawn than you actually need. You know, cycling the irrigation with the controllers so that you have shorter water periods. And then that helps to prevent the runoff. And then how high do you mow your lawn? And you know, keeping it to 2.5 to 3 inches tall during the entire season. So that makes a difference too in terms of water retention. And we'll talk about fertilization, but it's the same thing. It's going to encourage growth. Fertilizing anything is going to encourage growth, and that leads to the need for more water. Mulch is another one of the areas of things that you should think about in terms of a water-wise garden. And the benefit is it really helps to keep the soil moist, keeps water in the soil. It also reduces weeds, and weeds are definitely a competitor for water for your plants. So it helps to keep weeds down. It moderates soil temperature, increases soil nutrients, and prevents soil compaction. So we've all sort of seen these piles of mulch in our driveways ready to be put down on our lawns, but this is an organic mulch that you're looking at right here. And oops, gosh darn it, skipping a slide. My finger is hitting on it too hard. Sorry. You can use organic mulches, compost, fallen leaves, etc. are all organic mulches. They should be free of disease plant material, though. You want to make sure that there's no pesticide or herbicide that's in the mulch that you're getting. You want to put 3 or 4 inches on top of the soil. It does need refreshing, and kind of leave a space of a couple of inches around the base or the crown of a plant when you're putting down mulch. That just helps to prevent disease, etc. Then there are inorganic mulches, which are things like rocks and gravel. Those you want to put about 2 to 3 inches deep instead of 3 to 5. The type really depends on the style that you have and what you want in the look of your landscape. They do provide good drainage, but they don't really add any nutrients to the soil. So, you know, that's something to consider too. The organic mulches really help to add nutrients to the soil. The rocks and gravel also don't retain moisture as much, but they can look very nice. It's a nice way to add a little bit of interest without, it's not something that needs water, right? Doesn't need water. Landscape maintenance is another area that I know many people think, okay, in fact, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in landscape maintenance, but it's one of the things that is probably most important in terms of looking at water conservation. I said weeds, you know, weeds really do compete for water with your plants. So if you're watering and the weeds are taking a little bit more water than the plants, you just have to water more. So, you know, keeping your weeds down is really important. Avoid heavy pruning. Light pruning is fine, but heavy pruning, it facilitates growth, which requires more water. So the plant, you know, is going to continue to grow, and it's going to want water in order to do that. Don't overuse fertilizers. Same thing. It increases growth and demands more water. We've talked many times about infrequent deep watering, and what you're really after is a deep root growth, because those plants are going to have greater drought tolerance. And that's what you're really trying to achieve, is greater drought tolerance. And observe your garden for any kinds of pests or disease. One really key thing to do is make sure you spruce up your sprinkler system, right? Inspect the sprinkler heads. Make sure the spray is going where you want it. Make sure all the connections are good. You know, this is just a normal sort of getting ready for the season, making sure that your sprinkler system is all cleaned up. There's no leaks that are causing water to leak out, etc. So you really want to make sure your sprinkler system is in good working order. Here in Central Oregon, if you've lived other places, one of the things that's really important to maintain a good turf is to aerate and dethatch. This, of course, allows the water to actually penetrate the soil. And that's what you want. You don't want the water just pooling on top. If you're going to be watering, you want to make sure you've taken care of your turf appropriately by aerating and dethatching. So you want to do that in the spring when the grasses are growing actively, and making sure that this is just one of those normal things that you do every year, maybe every other year. It really depends a bit on the amount of thatch that is in your actual lawn, but that's something that you want to do on a regular basis. Again, it's water conserving that you're doing. This is water conservation. Mowing, we talked about the mowing a little bit. Mowing a higher height actually also helps to conserve water. You're going to mow less frequently, obviously as the growth decreases, but you want to try mowing it about the same height. Don't get the lawnmower down so low that you really shave off the top of the grass. Using a mulching mower is really a good idea. Leaving those grass clippings on the lawn really releases nutrients, and you may have to be able to not fertilize as much. So a mulching mower is a good idea here. It does not add to the thatch layer. It really will decompose and releases valuable nutrients. Talked about the minimizing the use of fertilizer. You know, trying to use a slow release fertilizer minimizes leaching out into the groundwater, et cetera. So something that just slowly is absorbed is really better. The use of a drop spreader is really better. Just the rotary spreader just sprays the fertilizer everywhere, which you don't want to do. And obviously putting the fertilizer down where the plants can take it up is where you want to put the fertilizer when you're fertilizing. So Holland's Head Waterwise Garden is at 1235 Northeast Jones Road. This is the Waterwise Garden. It has been here since 2017. This is its 5th season, and it's basically a mature Waterwise garden. We have different examples of different types of irrigation in this garden. So we have both the inline drip and the point source drip. We also have overhead spray with the high efficiency rotors. So if it's something that you're interested in seeing what it really looks like in action, make a trip to the Waterwise garden, and all the plants are labeled. You can get a really good idea of what does well here in Central Oregon. What are the kinds of things that are lower water use plants, and it should give you a really good idea of what your bottom line goal can be. There's just a few other photos of some additional pieces of the Waterwise garden. So with that, I guess we'll open
one
it up.
thing I'd like to add there, Pat,
Yes,
is
please.
that we're in the garden on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of every month during the summertime with volunteers, Waterwise working volunteers. And so you're welcome to come to the garden during that time so that you can ask us further questions about any aspect of the Waterwise gardening process. So that's the 2nd and the 4th Thursdays of the month in the mornings.
Right. And the garden is open all the time. So it's open to the public all the time, though. You can always come in and walk around yourself. There's some signage there that talks about the 7 principles of Waterwise gardening and those kinds of things. So it really does give you an idea of what can be done here. I also just want to point out these are the resources that you're going to be getting with the recording. So you can see the types of information that we pulled in to really, develop this presentation. Also, one thing I wanted to say too, the Waterwise Gardening in Central Oregon booklet that Chris held up. If you happen to be in Redmond at the OSU Extension office, which is at the fairgrounds, you can actually get a hard copy of the booklet. Those are available in the office area of the OSU Extension office. So just a thought, instead of trying to get it, sometimes it's hard to page through pages on the internet. So I guess at this point, we'll just open it up to questions, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Pat and Chris. So we have some questions from our audience. Nancy asked earlier that our yard was planted all grass a few years ago. Now she would like to kill it and go xeriscape. Should she leave the dead turf and dig out the spot for the new shrub? How should she approach moving from a lawn towards a xeriscape environment?
Well, is it sod that she has down on the, was it sod that she's thinking of removing? Because that's going to be different, I think, than, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to plant. You'll have to have a pretty big tiller to till in a sodded lawn, I would think.
Okay, maybe,
Yeah, I would think that you would have to remove the sod,
Yes.
or whatever kind of grass you have there,
Right.
because that's going to really impede the planting of any of your Waterwise system, and it's difficult. You can't do the hydrozone process and that kind of thing. So I would make every effort to remove that, and I'm sure while I'm not really familiar with the detail of that kind of process. I'm sure if you do a search on that, you can find answer, or the alternative is to call the Deschutes County Plant Clinic, and the number is, let me see.
541-548-6088. And I think it's on the last. I can't
it's
see
also
the
on
bottom
the
of my screen.
resource page.
It's on our
Right.
resources.
Right.
Yes.
And the other thing about making sure you remove all of the grasses, all of us who happen to have landscape that abuts against a lawn knows how grass grows into a garden bed. And I think you would have to make sure you removed all of the grass, or you would have grass coming up into your new beds, which of course you don't want. So it would be a challenge.
Thank you. Next question. In your very low ground cover earlier picture that you had one that had a purple ground cover. Could you tell us, do you know which one that was?
Yeah, I think it was the woolly thyme.
Yeah, it's woolly thyme, and I think the companion plant with that is a creeping phlox. So that picture was probably taken in the spring.
Wait a minute. It was
almost
very
there.
low. There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably just, it may be just a different type of thyme too.
Yeah,
This
it
is a
could
woolly
be thyme. Yeah.
Right. That's probably what it is. And that grows really well here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's really a stunning combination of two ground covers there.
Yeah, definitely.
Next question is, how much can Russian sage be pruned and still be healthy?
All the way.
Yeah.
6 inches,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Yep. It takes heavy pruning. So you can cut it back. It's one of those plants that rejuvenates when you cut it all the way back.
So we were talking about planting, and whether planting in the fall versus planting in the spring. In the fall might be a little bit better, but will be plant selection would be more difficult in the fall, or choices more limited, where we can maybe get some of those plants here locally in the Bend area.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
nurseries do tend to stock for the season. So you're right in that you do have a more limited plant selection in the fall, which is unfortunate. And we can hope that our next season will be not as drought heavy, but I don't know that we have much to be optimistic about there, about having less a drought in the next season in the fall and in the springs. But you can plant in the spring. You just are going to have to dedicate a little more of the precious water that you have to getting those plants established.
And you may be able to actually find some things in the fall that you wouldn't find in the spring, like the agastache. It's such a small, at this time of year, it's just a little small plant, and a lot of the nurseries wait for it to come further into flower before they actually even put it out to be sold. So some things you might actually find more in the fall than you would right now if you're looking for a particular plant.
Okay. In the topic of irrigation, what about using soaker hoses?
Yeah, I mean, soaker hoses are a type of drip irrigation. They don't have the emitters. So the inline drip that the photo that was in the presentation actually has little emitters that you can actually control the flow by there at the end. You put a little bit of a volume. I can't remember the name of it. It allows you to actually increase or decrease the amount of pressure so you can increase the amount of water. The problem with soaker hoses themselves is they do tend over time to get clogged up. And you have to do the same thing with the drip emitters, but not quite as much as the soaker hose. But a soaker hose will, you know, obviously it's going to soak an entire area. You'd probably want to put it in an area where you have you know, a fair amount of planting, but it would work the same as a drip emitter. You just may have more maintenance issues with it. You can't control the flow as much, etc. So, I mean, that's really the difference. But more and more drip systems are using the inline drip with the emitter holes in it. That's what we have at the Holland's Head Waterwise Garden, are the drip emitters. So, you know, you can, we have them buried pretty well, but they do poke up on top of the soil so you can see what they look like. But
So as a follow-up question on irrigation and drip irrigation, is drip irrigation really sufficient for perennials?
is it what? Is it sufficient?
Sufficient in terms of, you know, putting down, I mean, would it be sufficient to have drip irrigation to maintain good perennial beds?
Yeah, yes. Yes.
Okay.
You know, don't think of drip irrigation as, because you can, it depends on how often you actually run the drip. So you can run a drip system, you know, twice a week and put down as much water as you would over, you know, with a different kind of system. So yeah, you can regulate the amount of water that you have in a drip system similarly as you would to another system. So we have at the Waterwise Garden, we have drip systems around perennials and shrubs. We have a drip system.
One of the main benefits of the drip system is that the water goes right to the plant roots. Right. Which is where you want it to go. So it really focuses the placement of the water, which is a really good thing. You're not watering bare dirt. A drip system directs that water right to the root of the plant.
Right. Which is why with an inline drip, you want to have a heavier planted area, because you don't want to have a plant and then 2 feet, but you still have an inline drip and then another plant and another 2 feet. You're going to be watering an area where there is no plant. So that's where you do the circular, you do a circular drip around the plant itself. So that's the only thing that gets watered is the root system of the plant, like Chris was saying. So, you know, if you're going to do an inline straight drip, you want to have your plants close together, because that way you'll be watering plants and not soil, just soil.
So coming back to some of our plants, would fescue bunchgrass dry out too much to be also a good Firewise buffer if we were to use that as a lawn? Is that an issue of, can we balance Firewise with Waterwise?
Mhm.
Well, definitely, you can use lawns or any kind of low grasses as your defensible space area where you don't have a lot growing close to your house. You do have to be sure in your Firewise plantings is that you have no flammable material within 5 feet of your house. So you probably wouldn't normally have your lawn or grass area growing that close up to the house, but you do have to be careful with that, with what your mulch is. It has to be non-flammable. So oftentimes things like wood chips are flammable, and you really don't want those up close to your house. So in those kind of circumstances, you do better to look at the inorganic mulches for your lawn. But there's no reason why a Waterwise garden can't be also a Firewise garden. A lot of that has to do with the placement of your plants and the watering system.
Yes, and I will take this opportunity to also mention to our audience that we will have, as part of our webinar series, we do have a presentation on Firewise gardening here for Central Oregon. It will be, I believe, on the 23rd of April. You will find this information on our website if you're interested in this particular topic. Back to some pruning question. What about pruning lavender? How much, when does it take heavy pruning? Do I need to just leave it be? How about lavender?
I don't know
Well,
about lavender. So I
well, I
turned
know
that.
people do trim off the flower fronds after, the actual flowering pieces of the lavender after the flowers have bloomed, because you can use them for sachets and flower arrangements, etc. So people do prune that part of the plant down. I don't think that lavender takes heavy pruning. It's really it's a shrubby plant, and I don't think it does not take heavy pruning like the Russian sage question. You're not going to prune it like that. But I do think it takes some moderate pruning, but not heavy pruning.
Thank you for that. Talking about planting native this spring and trying to balance with risk of freezing still and waiting for later on in the spring versus planting when temperatures are starting to also get hot and require more water. Is there some rule of thumb, or is it, things that you mentioned, I think, during your presentation, protecting your plants if you were to plant them earlier? Can you give us a little bit of suggestions here?
Well, that's something that we always have to kind of gamble on here in Central Oregon, is timing of planting either in the spring or the fall as to when a freeze may come along. But once you get into about the end of May, the beginning of June, you can be pretty safe that you're not going to have a real hard freeze for an extended period of time during that time period. So it would be pretty much okay to plant at that time. One thing that you do want to do is, when you're putting in any new plant, is make sure that it's acclimated to your garden temperatures, before you actually put it out in the garden for the extended period of time. And you do that acclimation by bringing it out into the garden for increasing numbers of hours a day so that it will get acclimated. And oftentimes in both the spring and the fall, it's going to be cooler weather, so it'll get used to being cool. If there is a hard freeze projected, you do always have to listen to the weather here to find out whether a freeze is projected to come or not. And if it is, have something like row cover available that you can throw out over your plants, your newly planted plants, if you're worried about that, to protect it.
Yeah, it's a look, right now I wouldn't like things are starting to show up in the garden stores, I've noticed. I saw geraniums and those kinds of annuals. It's really too early to plant those right now. I mean, people I know chomp at the bit because they're ready for spring, but you shouldn't be planting those, and I'm not sure you should be planting them this year anyway, but you want the soil to be warm enough to accept the plant. I mean, obviously that's one thing that you want to consider if you're going to plant early, is whether the soil is warm enough. And like Chris said, hardening off the plant, acclimating the plant to the environment is really important to do. So just some helpful hints, hopefully.
Usually the soil should be around 50, 55 degrees. Right. Before you begin to plant, and right. You can get a soil thermometer, and they're a very handy tool, yeah, to have in your garden here.
Right.
And I would say also, I would like, adding to the answers that we have attendees here from different parts of Central Oregon. We have a lot of different microclimate. So, if it's a hard freeze in Bend or in Sun River, it may not be in Redmond. So this is something to be attuned to as well at that level. Diane is asking your thoughts on the use of mycorrhizae fungi when planting.
Well, mycorrhizae is obviously something that is in healthy soil, and I think that people do add it to their plantings. I think there's some question about making sure that you're actually getting mycorrhizae if you buy it in a bag, that it's still viable, etc. But I think that it's something that is certainly recommended. You don't have to do it, but I don't know, Chris, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, what I understand is that mycorrhizae are very specific to each individual plant. So while unless you know specifically what the mycorrhizae is for the variety of plant that you're using, it may not be effective at all with that plant. That's why I think there's concern about whether they're really a good buy and a really good addition to your ground. But I know a lot of people use them and swear by them. So
we'd have to do a little additional research. I don't know what the latest information is out there about that. So have to do a little research.
So that may actually be a good question to call into our plant clinic, for some of us to follow up and do some research on that.
Right.
Question here, Mafi Roy, the green bags full of water hanging near the bottom of younger trees, do they have a place in Central Oregon? And I have to say, I do not actually have a picture of what that looks like, but Pat, Chris?
Yeah, I think those are just water bags. I mean, they're filled with water and they're around newly planted plants in order to help get that newly planted tree established. I have seen them in areas where there may not be any kind of in-ground irrigation, where they're just trying to get the tree established. That's where I've seen those. And actually, we were considering doing it for one of our trees in the Waterwise garden that has kind of suffered over the winter time because it's been, you know, relatively dry. I think they probably are effective. I mean, you're putting it around the root ball, although it doesn't spread out far enough. I mean, they're relatively close into the trunk of the tree, but you know, certainly they will deliver the water over I'm assuming a slow period of time.
One
Looked
area
into that,
where
Chris?
I've seen them used quite a bit is along street trees.
Right.
In that
Exactly.
narrow strip of ground between the sidewalk and the street. And then one thing that's good about that green bag is that it delivers water directly to the tree, and you don't get it going out onto the sidewalk or the street. So you get water that's been effective. But of course, it, like Pat said, it is limited to that area right around the trunk. So
Right.
It doesn't get out to the roots that are out to the drip line of the tree,
Right.
which is where a lot of the water absorption occurs with shallower roots at the tree. So
Right.
it plays a role, but I don't think it's the total solution
Right.
to watering trees.
Right.
So Muffy was letting us know that they are quite used in Ontario, Canada, and they're effective there.
Oh, good.
Obviously,
Yeah.
not necessarily the same environment as ours, but
Mhm.
Well,
Claire
it's
was
certainly better than no water at all on those trees. I mean, because you're right, that's where I've seen them too. They're along the water, the fire strip, or whatever you want to call that. You know, it's it's an area that doesn't really get a lot of water, and they are street trees. So that's you know, good news. Thanks.
Yeah. So, question about aspens. Can you talk or warn us about aspens? Why are they so frequently planted in newer development, and taking them out as they
Well,
potentially use a lot of water?
why are they? Is because they're fast growing. I mean, that's why they're used. They're fast growing. They're beautiful trees. They also
Great.
they create lots of problems, which is why we try to dissuade people from using them. They're relatively short-lived. They are prone to pests. They also send up suckers that will go out into many areas of your garden, lawn, wherever you don't want them, they will be. So, you know, we try to dissuade people from using them. There are other types of faster growing trees that are probably less prone to pests and other kinds of problems than the aspen.
That booklet, the Waterwise Gardening in Central Oregon, has a good number of deciduous trees that would
Right.
give you options, other trees to select. One additional trouble with the aspen is once you get them in and they start to sucker, it's almost impossible to get rid of them.
Right. Exactly.
Yes, aspens. We get a lot of questions about aspens.
Yeah.
During the
Well, they're
year.
beautiful tree. I mean, people
Yes,
like
they're
them.
beautiful. So our last question today, and that may be a question, maybe more pointers than actually answering the question. Claire is asking, on average, how often should she be running her drip system and for how long? Of course, it's very specific to what, plants that she has, blue oat grass, salvia, catmint, well established, but how would somebody try to get a sense of how often and how long? Does digging to the root is that the answer to something like this, to see if the soil is taking the water, or how can you test that you're doing it right?
Well, I think one of the answers is just what you said, looking to see how far the water has actually penetrated into the soil using either a soil probe or a trowel to get down there and see how much is really being absorbed. The other thing is to use those little measuring things, because like for a lawn, you're really looking at, 1.5 to 2 inches a week. So you can actually measure the amount of water that's being put down. Now, whether or not that's being absorbed, that's where assessing you know, how deeply the water is really penetrating is important. There's probably not a formula. You know, I think that it's easy for people, you know, landscape companies, et cetera, to set your sprinkler system 3 times, you know, every other day for, you know, 20 minutes or whatever, and then never assess it. You know, they just look to see whether the lawn is green, and if it's green because it's got too much water, it doesn't really affect them. So I think that, you know, you need to assess how deep into the soil is the water actually going, assess how the plant looks. Is the turf green? Is it turning a little gray green? Does it, you know, when you step on it, does it pop right back up? How are the plants doing? You know, the shrubs, are they wilting? I mean, some of it is just observation on the actual plant itself. So if you see a plant that's wilting, then it's probably not getting enough water. But if it looks healthy and you've assessed the soil, you know, you're going to have plants that are not going to need a lot of water. Like Chris was saying, the low water use plants, you know, you may not need to water as much as you are. And you have to observe the plant, observe the soil, and it's sort of a trial and error kind of thing, really. And I think we're pretty used to just setting things and forgetting them. And I think we can all probably do better at actually assessing the soil and assessing the plants to know how much water to put down. You want to add anything, Chris?
Yeah, folks will remember we had the chart up when we were talking about hydrozones, and that hydrozone is, you know, if you'll remember, it has plants all that have similar types of water requirements, and the recommendations for a hydrozone in the low water use category is approximately half an inch of water per week, or lower than that. So if you're using the hydrozone process, there are specific recommendations for once your plants are established as to how much you should be putting down into the soil. One of the resources that's available is the City of Bend Water Conservation Site, and they do have an extensive section there on irrigation systems, and with a lot more detailed information than we would be prepared to provide. But once again, if you live in the city of Bend, they can come out and help you assess that and what your system is doing now and what it can do and how much water you can save.
So what our very, very last question, there's just one that just came in and the last, hopefully maybe you can give us a few pointers. What Waterwise tree can you use that would be a barrier in the landscape with your neighbor? Do you know some on top of your head, or do we look at the booklet?
I'd look at the booklet and see what that, you know, some of that's going to be dependent upon the size of tree that you're going to need to provide that barrier, that whether you want a deciduous tree or whether you want an evergreen, it's this barrier, you need it all year long. So look in that booklet and get some suggestions from there. But be careful. It's always, you want to do the right plant in the right place. And that's an issue, particularly with trees and shrubs. So refer back to the booklet, talk with your nurseryman, and see what you can come up with there.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are some nice low water use tree, you know, smaller trees that you could use. And I would second what Chris said. Initially, you may, if you're trying to create a barrier, you may tend to planting them too close together because you want to create the barrier right away. you're probably going to be better off to space them appropriately for the mature growth of whatever it is that you plant, because otherwise you'll be trying to make them fit, and it's going to be a difficult thing to do. So just look at the mature size and go from there.
5 to 10 years down the road from now, you may be figuring out how you're going to have to take some of those trees out.
Right.
So,
Well, we have come to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much, Pat and Chris. Thank you very much, our audience, for joining us today. Again, this presentation was recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be available shortly and will be forwarded on to you within the next 48 hours, I believe. When you exit the webinar, you will be presented with a survey. Please take the time to do so. It's a short survey, but it's very important to us to assess how we presented the information to you today, and also what other topics you would like us to address in the future. And finally, thank you to our sponsors. And also, if you have a chance, please visit our silent auction for our spring seminar. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.